Let's talk about some ancient Chinese history. Oh yeah. Chinese history is divided into periods called dynasties. A dynasty is the rule of an emperor or king from a continuous family line. A dynasty lasts as long as a family continues to produce emperors or is overthrown either by rebellion or war. Typically, emperors were male, but in some rare instances, there were female empresses. Empress Wu. One of the first dynasties of China is the Shang Dynasty. They ruled from about 1750 BC to 1045 BC. The Shang were the first to probably build Chinese cities. Kings would create new towns and then give land to their family members, and they would create more towns. These other towns would produce clothing and weapons and farming equipment for the kings. They would also provide the soldiers that would fight to protect the kingdom. Armies during this time used chariots and bronze weapons. During this time, Shang Society was ruled by kings who would choose warlords to govern separate territories. A warlord is a military leader who has command over his own army. Both the king and the warlords made up the upper class in Shang society. They were called the aristocrats, not the aristocats. The aristocrats. Everybody knows that. Aristocrats would inherit their wealth and social status from their family members. Position, power, and land were passed on from generation to generation. Most of the population during this time were farmers who worked on the lands owned by the aristocrats. Aristocrats. Can't stop doing that. Some of the population were enslaved people that were captured during war. Fu Hao was China's first female emperor. She was the wife of King Wu Ding. She was famous for her strength, martial arts skills, and military strategies. She helped her husband on the battlefield and also ruled her own town. Fancy lady. In the Shang Dynasty, the people worshipped gods and spirits. Religion and government were closely linked together. Kings were to contact the gods and ancestors before making any important decision. They would use something called oracle bones to help them make these decisions. These were animal bones with questions scratched on them by the priest. Then they would take a hot metal rod and put it into the oracle bone, and it would make a crack. The priest would then read the cracks to see what the gods were saying. The people believed that they needed to give the gods food and other items to make the gods happy. They believed that if they were happy gods, they would have good harvest. People also made offerings to their dead ancestors, believing that their dead ancestors would bring them good luck. Good luck with that. Early Chinese writings used pictographs and ideographs. Pictographs were simple drawings or characters that represent objects. Ideographs joined two or more pictographs together. An example of this is the ideograph for East. It took the pictograph of the sun rising above trees. Sun comes, up from the east. Makes sense. During the Shang Dynasty, there grew a gap between the very wealthy and the very poor. This is never a good thing. Shang kings began to treat the poor very cruelly. An aristocrat named Wu Wang led a rebellion against the Shang Dynasty. After defeating them, Wu started the Zhou Dynasty. The Zhou Dynasty ruled for 800 years longer than any other Chinese dynasty. It is often called China's Classic Age because of the growth, wealth, and activity. The Zhou king was the head of all the government. You need a good, strong central government to have a great dynasty. Under him was a large bureaucracy. A bureaucracy is a group of people chosen to be in charge of different sections of the government. They would be responsible for things like different cities and towns and roads and buildings and military. They helped the king to govern the land. Zhou kings also divided up the government into separate territories and then allowed the aristocrats to be in charge of those territories. Positions held by aristocrats were hereditary. That means they were passed on from generation to generation. This means that the positions were taken over by a relative when they died. This means that the most qualified person might not be working that particular job. China is going to fix this later with the civil service exam. We'll talk about that at another time. The Chinese believed that the king was the link between heaven and earth. His chief duty was to carry out rituals to keep the gods happy. This gave him his authority. And this authority is called the mandate of heaven. The king is supposed to live out what's called the proper way, or Tao. This puts a lot of pressure on the king because if the gods are happy, then the harvest is good and they win battles in war. But if the gods are not happy, let's say a natural disaster comes like flooding or drought, or they start to lose battles, that means the gods are not happy with the king and the king is a failure. This allowed the people to overthrow the king. The Zhou Dynasty came up with different methods for irrigation and flood control. They also came up with new farming techniques, and they used the iron plow. This helped them to produce more crops, and with more crops, they can have an increase in population. These new advancements also helped increase trade, and an important trade item during the Zhou Dynasty was silk. Silky. Over time, local rulers of the territories became more powerful and stopped obeying the Zhou kings. I said Zhou kings. In 403 BC, fighting broke out for over 200 years. This is called the period of warring states. In 221 BC, the ruler of the Qin, which was one of the warring states, defeated all the other states and started a new dynasty, the Shang Dynasty. But that's a story for another time. That's all we have for today. I'll see you next time. The Zhou Dynasty came up with different methods for irrigation, and I don't remember.